Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, December 29th, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 election projection between Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and President Joe Biden of course, the United States of America. The reason why I am making this is because there was a new article released in the Washington Post that says that Trump's intentions aside, Senator Ted Cruz says he's next in line to secure the 2024 GOP presidential nomination. Now, I briefly talked about this in my video where I referenced that Joe Biden actually wants to run against Donald Trump in 2024, and I think this is largely due to the fact that Donald Trump has already lost a presidential election, and the Democrats think that it is very possible that he could lose yet another. But Ted Cruz has taken to the press, and maybe not necessarily intentionally. He said in an interview with the Truth Gazette, which is a conservative outlet ran by a 15-year-old, and this is, I think, something that Ted Cruz, I don't think he expected to gain traction across the mainstream media. I think that this comment was made more so for the audience that it was geared towards rather than the national news front. But at the end of the day, he said what he said. And he says that he would absolutely consider a run for president in 2024. In fact, Cruz said that he thinks it's very likely that Republican voters will give him the nomination. He points out the fact that Richard Nixon ran for president and then lost the primary and then ran again and won. The same case for Ronald Reagan, the same case for John McCain, and the same case for Mitt Romney. Now, 2 out of the 4 people here, so half of them, were able to win their general elections. The other half were not. So I don't know if he's necessarily indicating that he would be likely to win the general election, but more so that he would be likely to win the nomination simply because he is the runner-up. He says that he has an enormous base of support coming from the 2016 presidential primaries, and that his campaign raised $92 million, the most money any Republican has ever raised in the history of presidential elections. So Ted Cruz definitely seems to be gearing up for yet again another presidential bid, and I think it's very important to see some type of prediction between Joe Biden and Ted Cruz as this becomes an increasingly more possible reality for America, that Ted Cruz will face off against Joe Biden. Interestingly enough, this could have happened in 2016 had history been altered just very slightly. So let's go ahead and take a look at where the strengths and weaknesses would reside for both political candidates in this 2024 matchup. Again, these matchups are not estimations about what the country will look like in 3 years from now, rather what they look like today and how that would apply to a 2024 presidential election. So we are working within the snapshot of time that it is right now, and also working in the fact that Joe Biden is an unpopular president and Ted Cruz is currently remaining as a senator from the state of Texas, as he will remain through 2024. But the unpopularity doesn't necessarily need to stay for Joe Biden. So looking at these states that we can characterize straight off the bat, we know there is a significant portion of states that already are declared straight from the get-go. There isn't going to be any contending of Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana. These states are long gone for the political party that is the Democratic Party. And I also think that we are going to see some minor improvements relative to where either Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump might be in some states that were previously Republican strongholds that shied away from electing or necessarily re-electing Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election, or even voting for him in the first place in 2016. There have been significant reductions in support in states such as Alaska, which have now narrowed down to a 10.1% margin for Donald Trump when it voted for other Republicans, sometimes by 20, even 30 percentage points. So you can see that there is some discontent there among states that were previously Republican strongholds. But these are states that I think with Ted Cruz on the Republican ballot could end up actually benefiting and improving based off of the margin that we saw either in 2020 or even 2016. Of course, there are safe states on the Democratic side that we can characterize at this point. Now, if you see a state and you're wondering, why isn't this considered to be a safe state? Safe means that a state is being won by a margin of 15 points or higher. I don't feel comfortable characterizing any of the states in gray as a 15-point or higher margin of victory for either side at this point in time. And yes, that includes Oregon and South Carolina. I think it's very possible that the states end up being 14% margins for whichever party I assign to them. But again, that's not considered safe because it isn't within that margin. And since I'm talking about that, let's go ahead and characterize the likely states to alleviate any type of major, consideration of some of these states being the true toss-ups, because we are going to hone in on a special couple and they will take up the majority of the time. And the reasoning behind it, of course, will as well. So states such as Oregon and New Jersey can certainly be characterized as likely states, not Pennsylvania. That's not going likely for either political party in this election or matchup, maybe in the election when it eventually comes around. We're going to characterize South Carolina as a likely state for the GOP. I think that's a fair estimation at this point in time. And another state that I would characterize as likely for the GOP is the state of Texas. Now, this is Ted Cruz's home state, and I do want to point out that Ted Cruz has performed nearly identical, at least from 2012, to how the top of the ticket, the presidential contender, does in the state of Texas. Mitt Romney won by 15.8%, and Ted Cruz won in an open race by a margin of about 16.1%. So winning with these margins, I would say, and looking at the comparison, there was actually a significant reduction in support between 2012 and 2018. Ted Cruz was up for re-election in 2018, and while he did survive, he only won his election by 2.6%. Keep in mind that Beto O'Rourke was running as a representative from a little-known district in Texas. He was by no means a big name across the state, and he made a point to visit every single county across the state of Texas, and that's where he got a lot of his name recognition. And then he ran for president, peaked at third place in preliminary polling data before any of the primaries actually occurred, or caucuses, or whatever it might be. And then in addition to that, you saw that Beto O'Rourke was able to, and now is, running for governor in the state of Texas. So Ted Cruz faced off against a very, very big opponent, but someone who was able to turn a Senate race that used to be safe red into even toss-up status. I mean, Texas was a state that was closer than two states with Democratic incumbents, North Dakota and Indiana. In fact, add Missouri in the midst, and then you have three states with Democratic incumbents that were larger margins of victory for the opposing Republican Party in a Democrat +8 national environment than Texas. Keep that in mind. So I don't expect Ted Cruz to revolutionize Texas on the presidential margin. Some people might have an argument against that, but at the end of the day, Ted Cruz hasn't exactly been going above and beyond presidential contenders, and in fact underperformed Donald Trump twice, given his 2018 Senate performance. So keep that in mind. And Texas itself isn't exactly a state that can be characterized as a solid red state anymore. A lot of people on the right like to characterize it and consider it to be the Republican Party's California. But at the end of the day, the thing about Texas is that it can never be compared to California anymore. California voted for Joe Biden by nearly 30 points. Texas voted for Trump by nearly 6 points. There is a significant difference there, and I think the Republican Party will find out a little too late that Texas is in fact a swing state, the same way that Democrats found out a little too late that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were swing states in the 2016 election. But that's a topic for another video. Now we're at 165 for Ted Cruz and 180 for Joe Biden, but good news for the Democrats, they aren't done in terms of likely states. I'm also going to characterize Colorado and New Mexico as likely states, and some people might say, you know, Romney and McCain were able to keep those states at least somewhat contentious, not necessarily McCain actually, but George W. Bush. So prior traditional Republicans, but Donald Trump didn't, wouldn't Ted Cruz return you to that sense of normalcy for the GOP? I don't know. I think that we have seen a major reduction in support for the GOP since Donald Trump was elected, including the year that he was elected, and it is important to point out, Colorado voted for Joe Biden by 13.5%. New Mexico voted for Biden by 11%. There is a bit of room to fall for the Democrats to remain in the likely column, and I think they would remain there even against Ted Cruz as a Republican nominee. And the next state that I'm going to characterize as likely, and this is actually not a state, this is a congressional district, two of them actually for the GOP. Nebraska second and Maine second. I think that there has been a significant overhaul of Obama, Kerry, Gore voters in Maine's 2nd District that have turned into Republican Party voters ever since 2016, and they are going to stay there. And I think they will stay for Ted Cruz. Nebraska 2nd is a bit trickier. I think that I expect Donald Trump number 1 to win that 2nd District in a matchup against Joe Biden. So given that alone, I automatically expect Ted Cruz to do well in that 2nd District. I mean, you are looking at a district that was fine with Romney, that was voting for Obama but out of the national swing that we saw, and a district that never deviated from the rest of Nebraska until 2008, and then again in 2020. And looking at the district now, Not only do I think Ted Cruz would be a better performing Republican than Trump, but the district was actually, and is now, drawn in a more Republican district because of gerrymandering. So keep that in mind when you look at the 2nd district now. It's no longer the 2nd district of the past. It's slightly more Republican, but when you see the victories for the House candidates or even Donald Trump in 2016, just a few percentage points can certainly go a very long way. So now we're about done with the likely states, and let's move on to the states that are considered to be lean or tilt. Now, all of these remaining states, actually, I forgot one. The state of Maine has a 1st district that I'm going to characterize as likely blue, but that's one electoral vote. Doesn't change much about the map. The rest of these states are true toss-ups, and that's a lot. 175 true toss-ups. Now, I do want to say that the electability of Ted Cruz, I think, is very much overrated. And I say this to point out the fact that 2016, I don't think Ted Cruz could have won. In fact, I don't think many Republicans could have defeated Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump was an individually strong candidate because he did well in regions of the nation that Republicans have been trying to tap back into since Ronald Reagan's era. I mean, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all three of these states had not voted together for the GOP since Ronald Reagan. In 1988, I think there might have been one victory for the Democrats in Michigan, or maybe it was the opposite, one victory for Republicans in Michigan. But beyond that, they hadn't had victories since 1988 in any of the 3 states until Donald Trump came around. I mean, imagine Marco Rubio trying to go to Wisconsin and appealing to the Rust Belt workers there. The only person who truly could have done it was Donald Trump. Does that mean that no other Republican could have won the presidential election? I don't necessarily know. I think that there might have been Republicans that could have won in Colorado and Virginia, whereas Donald Trump did not. But that is a whole nother type of video and a whole nother realm of reality. But I think that Ted Cruz definitely would have underperformed Donald Trump even if he was to win the presidential election, given different circumstances. I think that looking at the election data, and I know I'm going to get slammed by some of you guys, I don't treat polls as the only standard and metric of analyzing elections, but when there was no election between Ted Cruz and Hillary Clinton, it's all we've got. And number 2, polling data and the Trump effect really only happens when Trump is on the ballot. Look at 2020 versus 2018. Polling was near perfect in 2018, but then when 2020 came around, it was off again. In 2016, it was off, but in 2014, it was near perfect. In 2012, it was near perfect. In 2010, in 2008, you saw polls tell us who the victors were going to be on a near perfect accuracy. It was only Donald Trump that really made the election different. So when you see these numbers and you see that Ted Cruz underperforms Donald Trump in practically every single swing state when it comes down to polling data, I kid you not, Clinton leads in every single one of the states that I'm going through. She leads in Michigan by 8, Pennsylvania by 7, Wisconsin by 1, narrow, but I think polls are much more accurate between Clinton and Cruz than they were between Trump and Clinton. Looking at Virginia, Clinton is ahead. Florida, Clinton is ahead by 6. North Carolina, Clinton is ahead by 1. Colorado, Clinton might be counteracted by this new Quinnipiac poll that I'm not entirely sure when it was actually taken because I don't know how they didn't do a single poll during the entirety of the 2016 election season in Colorado, because this would imply the last poll was taken in 2015. But I think that looking at the rest of the polls and aggregate of them all, Clinton still maintains her lead in the state of Colorado. So looking at all of the numbers, looking at the historical numbers between Ted Cruz and also the underperformance of Ted Cruz in some major states in the 2016 Republican presidential primary. I mean, he came from the state of Texas and couldn't even get above that threshold in order to prevent Donald Trump from getting any delegates. He won 43.76% of the vote. He needed over 50% in order to win all of the delegates, but did not get all of the delegates. Looking at the primary there, I mean, Donald Trump showed him that a fourth of voters in your own home state simply don't want you. And the rest of the candidates proved that the majority was actually against Ted Cruz, which I think is something to point out as well. So keep that in mind. When you look at his electability, I think that while in our current snapshot, in our current state of the nation, that Ted Cruz would perform better than he would have in other circumstances, I do want to say that I don't necessarily think Ted Cruz is an S-tier candidate for the GOP. There is definitely a lot to be considered when it comes down to a presidential contender, and just the fact that he is a runner-up, I think, doesn't necessarily make him the more electable candidate, as voters have clearly expressed in the 2016 election cycle. So let's go ahead and continue. The states that I think are going to be lean for the GOP will ultimately, I think, not necessarily shock you, but more so puts you back into a prior to Trump type of era when you look at some of these states. When you see states such as Georgia return to the lean Republican column and Arizona, you begin to understand that the sentiment here was very much anti-Trump. And I think that it's a lasting effect. The lasting effects of the Trump administration on the American electorate need to be noted. And that's why Arizona and Georgia are not likely red states. They should remain as lean red states, and I think that there will be flips in favor of the GOP with Ted Cruz on the ballot and improvements amongst Republican Party and conservative-leaning voters. But there still, again, are significant effects of Trump even being on the ballot in 2016 and 2020 in the first place that I think have converted many previously independent Republican-leaning voters to solid Democratic voters, as we've seen in the Atlanta metro area, which only continues to grow. And the same thing can be said in Maricopa County, specifically in the Phoenix region. And I don't think it'll come as a shock that states that voted for Trump by likely margins, such as Iowa and Ohio, are now lean states. And I say that this shouldn't come as much of a shock because Ted Cruz is not Donald Trump. He does not have the ability to reach out to and win over these swaths of voters in the white working class region that is the Rust Belt. He does not have the ability to perform as well as Donald Trump did in either 2016 or 2020. Joe Biden, I think, is probably one of the best candidates that the Democratic Party could have propped up in 2020 for specific Rust Belt appeal. And yet Donald Trump nearly won these states, even being disapproved of by 8 points nationwide. So Ted Cruz, I think, is at more of a disadvantage because Joe Biden, I think, will be able to tap into voters that were fine with Obama, but really liked the ideology of Trump, really liked what he represented, but still, in many cases, backed Democrats such as Gretchen Whitmer in 2018 or Debbie Stabenow in 2018 or even Gary Peters in 2020. And I think there are a lot of voters like that that need to be pointed out. So as we look at the Rust Belt, including Iowa, I think that it is fair to say that there is going to be an underperformance in terms of support compared to if Donald Trump was on this ballot. Even as a rerun candidate, he has the appeal that no other Republican could tap into for a very long time. And that needs to be pointed out. But other Republicans simply can't replicate it as easy. That means states such as Minnesota are going to be lean. And I've brought up the point of the lasting effects of the Trump administration and Trump's election to sort of show you why I still have Virginia in the blue column. I think that Virginia, even though it voted for Youngkin and elected Republicans to the House of Delegates, narrowly, but still did so, and elected a Republican Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor, I think that was more of a pushback on Biden than it was a call for help for the GOP. I think that Biden, being unpopular, turned voters away from him in the state of Virginia. But when it comes down to a presidential election, people are more likely to put aside their approval rating of the president when it comes down to an actual election where the president is on the ballot. Take a look at 2018 versus 2020. While Donald Trump was nearly disapproved of by a similar margin in 2018 versus 2020, there was a significant improvement, not only for Donald Trump, but also for Republicans across the nation on the presidential ballot. That's because people aren't inclined to use the presidential election in most cases, and that's why most presidents are reelected, in most cases, to push back on the president's agenda. That's what the midterms are for. So they expressed their discontent in 2018, they expressed their discontent in 2014, 2010, 2006, 1998, 1994, yet Donald Trump was the only president out of all of those midterms with an incumbent president that lost re-election, and even so, it was narrow. So as I look at this, and as I see this, I think that there won't be some type of major wave against Joe Biden on the presidential ballot if it actually is a presidential ballot. And with this, I'm going to characterize North Carolina and Florida as GOP states. And this puts the Republicans much closer to 270, specifically Ted Cruz. Florida, I think, will remain a lean red state. I think he will underperform Donald Trump in 2020, meaning it'll be less than 3.3%, but still a win, and a win is winner take all in this electoral college system, so should be celebrated. In North Carolina, I think Ted Cruz returns the state back to a traditional Republican, and they improve in terms of their margin. Let's continue. Moving beyond those states, there are 219 electoral votes for Joe Biden and 263 for Ted Cruz. As we move up to the Northeast, Joe Biden wins Maine at large, but I think Ted Cruz would win in New Hampshire. And I think that that comes not necessarily as a shock, but more so as, again, a return to normalcy, a return to a sense of comfort conservatism. And that's what you're going to see across many of these states that pushed away from Trump very heavily, that might be inclined to elect a Republican like Ted Cruz. And looking across the Rust Belt, I did say that he would underperform Trump, but that doesn't necessarily mean he would lose states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I think he would lose Michigan. I think Michigan, being the state that voted for Joe Biden by the largest margin in the Rust Belt, needs to be pointed out. And it was also the state that voted for Donald Trump the least in 2016. So knowing this and seeing it as Obama's biggest victory in both 2012 and 2008 amongst those states, it is something that definitely should be pointed out and does sort of reach out about its testament as a blue state and a state that has been solidly a part of the blue wall for such a long time. And the final state that I need to characterize is the state of Nevada, where honestly, I don't see much luck for Ted Cruz. I think that he will perform well in a bunch of states, but a return to normalcy also means a return to consistent losses for the GOP in the state of Nevada. And I also don't think Ted Cruz has this ability to win over Hispanic/Latino voters the same way Donald Trump does. And while that may not necessarily matter on the grand scheme of things, meaning that it won't make or break an election, it definitely will make or break states like Nevada that need to be won on every front in order for the GOP to win. There's a reason why Democrats have had consistent victories across the state, even though they may falter in certain regions or certain categories of voters. What Republicans need to do is tap into all of them, and that simply isn't attainable in this election. So the final map is 296 electoral votes for Ted Cruz and 242 for Joe Biden. Still a victory for Republicans, but not necessarily this overwhelmingly large margin that some people might be expecting by a candidate besides Donald Trump on the ballot. There are so many things to consider when it comes down to a presidential election, and there were a bunch of improvements that Donald Trump made for the GOP across the states, and I think that needs to be celebrated for the GOP's sake. But on the other hand, there were some significant drawbacks of him being on the ballot as well. And you can see the lasting effects of both sides of this on this map. So again, to recap, 296 to 242, not a super impressive victory, but defeating an incumbent president is always a very good feat for the opposition party. And I think that the Republican Party, if they were to nominate Ted Cruz today, he would defeat Joe Biden on the presidential map. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.